Okay, Amy, so I wanted to give you a slightly more professional version of the, so I'm not deathly ill or something weird, but to document all the steps that we talked about to go from a finished plied skein of yarn to the way that it's all finished and wrapped up, so that you can kind of see, to keep track of it all. And plus, because I was thinking about doing it anyway, and I'm thinking about working on my YouTube channel, and because once I have this recorded, then I don't have to type it up to the next person that I want to tell them to. So all of those are good reasons for making a little tutorial. So you spun your singles on individual bobbins, and you spun them clockwise, and then you're going to ply them counterclockwise. We talked about a couple of other ways that you could ply, like taking it from a center pull ball, and the chain plying, which is sometimes called Navajo plying, but that's not very nice to say because I don't know that it necessarily is strictly a Navajo cultural thing. So anyway, we talked about a couple of those other techniques, but what we're going to do right now is just to handle, you could do this with any skein of yarn, but our primary focus was on a 2-ply skein of yarn where the individual singles were spun with an Z twist, and the plies were done with an S twist, and that's why I kind of wrote it in the air in front of me. So those singles are called that because of the shape of the diagonal line in the middle of an S and a Z, and that's how they're classified. So just in case you ever hear that someplace else. So I took the skein, I took the yarn off of my wheel. I kept the wheel under a slight amount of tension while I skeined it onto this niddy knotty, mostly because I didn't want it to tangle as I worked. I tied it to the post of the niddy knotty here, and then I wrapped it in sort of like a W shape. If you put a W on the inside of a tube, that's the shape, and you just kept going, a zigzag line going around in a circle. So normally I hold it by the center part of the post, and I work across, and then I kind of like loop it around. And this is another activity that's really great to do while you're wearing your Fitbit. Sometimes, if I'm really exaggerated with my motion, I can use my Fitbit as a rotation counter and count how many yards, but that's not really reliable, and you shouldn't do that. That's just to be silly. This niddy knotty makes a 2-yard skein of yarn, which means that if you took a measuring tape and you went in that like W shape from the first point back around to where you started, it would be a 2-yard length of yarn. So what I can do is I can measure how many counts there are. I just go across and I just do one strand at a time and I count them. If it's really thin yarn, I sometimes like take an extra piece of yarn or twine or something and like make it into bundles, so in case I lose count, I don't have to start all over again. So because this is a 2-yard skein, I count how many strands there are and then multiply it by 2, and that's the yardage that I have on my finished product. The yardage will increase slightly after wet finishing. I find the yarn tends to stretch a little bit for wool. Other fibers might do that more, and I haven't really made a careful study of what that impacts. So I've put it on the niddy knotty, I've counted the number of yards, and forgot to write it down. But the project I'm going to work on for this piece of yarn isn't all that important. When it's a project that really matters, then I write it down and I keep careful notes somehow. And then, like I showed you before, I tied it in 2 different places. So this was the end of the yarn right here. I just kind of like loosened it and I tied it around. This was just an extra piece of yarn that was sitting next to my wheel, but at least 2 choke ties because it will get tangled when you do the next step. Okay, so that's all of the things to be said about niddy knotty usage. So now I'm going to pop it off the end. Now there are beautiful niddy knotties made out of wood. I had this PVC pipe laying around, and so that's what I used because I'm kind of a scavenger like that. The other thing I like about the PVC niddy knotty is that sometimes I do different techniques and things on it while the yarn is wet, and so I don't like putting it on the wood, but that's like really specific techniques. So if you hear someone else say, well, I like my PVC niddy knotty because I can do wet yarn, there's almost no times when you will be doing that. I used to do a lot more art yarn, and it kind of comes up in that case. In most cases, when you hear someone say that they prefer their PVC Nitty Knotty, it's because they're trying not to feel bad about the fact that they spent $3 on a Nitty Knotty instead of making something nice and fancy. That's just my opinion. Anyway, so now I have this nice skein of yarn, and like we said earlier today, so there's a couple, I like that it's hanging pretty straight. After we wet finish it, it might have a little more twist. Hopefully it will have a little less twist, but it's already hanging pretty balanced. I'm satisfied with this yarn. I don't know how well you can see it with the lighting here, but it came nice and squishy, and I just feel like this is a yarn I'm satisfied with. So right here outside of the camera, I have this bowl of water. This is just a big mixing bowl, and since it always only has soapy water in it, I do not personally feel bad about sometimes using it for kitchen purposes and sometimes using it for yarn purposes. However, if I had active dye that had not been cooked properly, I would not mix them together. But this just has wool in it. So yes, it hangs out in my kitchen. It's basically like skin temperature, like a slightly warmer than room temperature, but not very warm at all. And I put just a drop of dish soap in it. There are wool washes and things. They are really essential products if you're trying to take dirt or lanolin out of wool, but it's not something that you need to just occasionally wash a skein of wool. Now, why use soap instead of just water, you may ask? Well, this fiber has had a long journey from my wonderful friend's shop in Washington through the mail, hanging out in my shop, getting mangled by cats, spun by me, both plies, plied together. All of those things means that lots of hands have been touching this wool, and cat mouths and things. There's not like because of all of the processing that has happened to this like highly processed wool, you're not dealing really with barnyard stuff anymore. It's really just people germs, and so the soap is just there to help clean that a little bit. I don't think it's really necessary other than that. So okay, so now I have it. I meddle around with it because I'm impatient and I like the way it feels. It's a very nice sensory experience, but you really don't want to mess with it too much, because the more you touch it, the more likely it is that it will tangle, and you will be very, very sad, because untangling wet yarn is a pain in the neck. And waiting for tangled yarn to dry is very discouraging, because it's so nice to hang a sweetly straight and beautiful skein of yarn and watch it slowly drip dry. But if you just hang this like tangled, mangled mat of gross, it's disappointing. So try not to tangle your yarn while it's here in the bowl. Also, if you really mess with it, you could felt it, which would be unfortunate too. Although you would really have to agitate it at this point. Okay, so now I'm not trying to wring it dry because I want it to be dry yarn. Just don't want to make a puddle on my counter. So I'm going to just sort of wring just a little bit of the water out. You can see that, you know, it's kind of puddly. Because now I'm going to replace this water with soapless water. So just fresh water, still body temperature, more or less. So one thing that you will find is that some dyers have different processes, different chemicals that they use. Ideally, you want the yarn to more or less not make the water any color at all. I would say that whatever color is here in this water is from like dirt in my hands and those kinds of things. But my daughter's gonna come and say hello. Hi.
Hi.
Okay, we're making a recording.
Oh.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Julie, out.
All right, thank you. But it does happen sometimes that the fiber that you're spinning or working with still has either dirt in it. This alpaca is a big culprit for that. It could still have lanolin in it. That's sort of its own subject, not to be covered in this video. And sometimes the fiber that you wash will still have some dye runoff. In most cases, that's just because it's been heavily pigmented, and then the dye that's sort of remaining isn't necessarily going to stain the rest of your yarn. It's just that there's some like dye particles that are left over. So it's really not going to hurt you. It's just not awesome because you see it and you're like, but I wanted all of that in the finished product. Well, you're out of luck. But in most cases, that won't be a problem. Okay, so I'm gonna dump this out and get some fresh water. I'm not really getting too much because I really just want to rinse whatever soap was remaining in there. Just a little bit. And now I'm going to put the skein back in and just give it a little scooch. Some people will be horrified. They think you need gallons and gallons of water to complete this step, and maybe it would be better if I was doing that, but this is what's happening. Okay, so now I'm really going to try to squeeze some more of the water out. And now I have the skein hanging down. This is my favorite part of the process. And again, just like I said when we were talking earlier, I mean, there's just different practices and there's people that have really strong opinions about each step of the process. This was how I have done it. This is how I've learned from various videos that I've watched over the years. And it's fun, and I believe that it has a positive impact on my finished yarn. But I haven't tested it thoroughly. Anyway, so I'm making sure that I'm holding it at one of these choke ties. Because even though you've tied it, I do still find that sometimes, like, some of the threads end up on the other side when you pick it back up, and especially when you're working with really fine yarn, that can get unfun. So I'm holding it by the choke tie to keep that straight. And then I'm just, how do I want to do this? I want to fold it in the middle. So the choke tie's in the middle. That way I can loop my thumb on it, but I'm also going to be like holding the other side, okay? So you see how I'm just like holding my fingers through there. And then we're going to whack it. And I hope that's not too loud. I have, over years of doing this, learned the exact spot on my counter where it doesn't make noise loud enough to wake my family. It's right here. Not over here, and not over here. But in this spot on my counter, it stays quiet. Woo! I think I hit the camera a little bit. Okay, so I have hit it a couple times, and now I'm just gonna let it hang out. And back over the bowl again, I'm going to give it another squeeze because normally that process, just like a salad spinner, kind of forces more of the liquid out. I'm not going to get too crazy with this because it really starts to drip out once I hang it to dry. Okay, so now at this point in the process, I'm going to just find a peg that I can hang this on. And there are criteria. The criteria for where the peg is that there's a bowl underneath to catch whatever drips, because from a skein about this size, about 1/4 cup more of water at least, if not more, like 1/2 cup, is gonna still run out, even though I've wrung this out pretty well. So it has to be someplace where water will catch so it's not like damaging floors or something like that. It has to be out of the reach of cats because my cats really like to play with yarn. And it has to be able to dry out over time. I'm going to check it. Normally I get impatient and about 10 hours later, so if it's hanging here, then I just like switch it so it's hanging here. I find, just to move it around a little bit, because I do find that as it dries, just like we said about like wet setting hair, if it dries completely 100% in one position, there's like a little dent, which is really not that big of a deal. Okay, so we skeined the yarn, we counted and hopefully recorded the yardage, we choke tied it in at least 2 places, we soaked it in soapy water, and then we rinsed it in clear water, and we hit it a couple of times on the counter. And now we're gonna hang it to dry. And that's the first round of prep work that happens with each skein after it comes off of your wheel. I hope that helps.